Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. This is Kiara speaking, and today I will be speaking to you about how my case study of a classroom from the film Dead Poet Society demonstrates the importance of effectively motivating students, but also effectively instructing them to meet content learning objectives, and how we can use educational psychology concepts to teach us that it's essential for a strong teacher to not just do one of these things, but both of them in order to support their students' learning. So to start off, I'm going to give you an outline of what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to remind you of a few key educational psychology concepts you already know about that are really relevant to the learners and teacher of this case study to help orientate you. So we'll start with a profile of our two case study students who are adolescents struggling emotionally and socially. So one concept that really applies to them is Erikson's psychosocial crisis model, which the graphic that we used in class on the top of this slide here should hopefully remind you of these stages. Next, I'm going to give you an evaluation of Mr. Keating, their English teacher. Some key concepts I want you to remember and think about in regards to him is the importance of intrinsically motivating students, and hopefully the graphic to the bottom left here can remind you of the definition of intrinsic motivation. And then hopefully the photo next to that can serve as a reminder of the importance of student-centered and cooperative learning in a class, which are key to understand what Mr. Keating lacks. Next, I'm going to talk about a potential lesson plan that incorporates these concepts, and then we're going to sum it all up with some key takeaways, and hopefully you can then provide me with some suggestions. So let's get started. Let's start with our students. So on the left, we have Todd Anderson. He's very intellectually and linguistically gifted, particularly when writing poetry, but he doesn't always excel academically because he's really afraid to show these skills due to his struggles with anxiety and lack of self-confidence and strong social skills. Neil on the right, though, is much more outgoing and very creatively gifted in the theater arts. He also academically excels, but a lot of this is due to his controlling family and the high expectations that they have for him, which leads to a lack of sense of control in his life, putting him at risk for mental health struggles, including depression and suicidal thoughts that he experiences. Both of these students have advantages in that they're of high socioeconomic status. They attend Welton Prep School, which is rather expensive and prestigious. They must be. And they also have the privileges of being, white males as well. They're also part of a solid peer group. However, they lack vital emotional support from their families and the rigid school environment. So, with these characteristics in mind, you can see how the motivational theories of interest and expectancy value really apply to them. The interest theory, if you remember, explains their particular gifts, with Todd excelling at poetry and Neil excelling in theater arts, because these are areas of their individual interest. But they're motivated in their academic subjects by their goals to meet different societal and familial expectations, so that's expectancy value. Much of their emotional struggles can also be explained by the identity versus role confusion crisis from Erikson's psychosocial model I asked you to think about earlier, because they're really trying to experiment with their identities and personal interests to find out their paths in life. So how does Mr. Keating address the needs of these learners? We can start with what he does well. He's excellent at developing strong relationships with his students, which is particularly important for Todd and Neil, who lack those emotional connections with other areas like their families. So as you can see from this top image and caption here, he speaks to students in a very direct, honest, and respectful way, really meeting them at their own level, and he uses active listening skills to provide students with the socio-emotional support that they really need. He also has a very engaging and unconventional teaching style, which can really be attributed to creating intrinsic and those interest-rooted motivations for students like Todd, who I talked about, really starts learning poetry for its own sake, and much of that is because of Mr. Keating's style. So for example, you can see from the bottom photograph an example of an activity that he engages students in. He stands on his own desk to visually demonstrate how important it is to see things from a different perspective when you're writing creatively. And then he asks students to follow suit with this activity. It's really attention grabbing and focusing for students that gets them engaged in the concept, and it's definitely a great way to make a lesson memorable by using that powerful imagery. If you remember that memory strategy we discussed in our cognitive learning chapter, they have that image of the teacher standing on a desk to drive that point home for the lesson. All that being said, there are things Mr. Keating can improve upon. While he does have students engaged for the whole class, the activities that he has them engage in are not always the most effective, since to have an effective learning environment, you can't overdo time on one task or concept. So, for example, in this bottom photo, students are very engaged in an activity in which they march around and demonstrate the dangers of conformity, which is a very interesting concept and a good way to incorporate movement in a lesson. But Mr. Keating actually spends all of the class time on just this one activity, which is just excessive. These kinds of activities are great to grab student attention, but if he's going to help students actually meet the learning objectives that a student in a high school English class should be meeting, he needs to focus on teaching actual writing and analysis skills after doing these kind of unconventional engaging activities. So if you think back to the vignette and our assessment chapter about the teacher who does a bunch of interesting activities and tells fun stories about the Civil War, which students love, but then they get to an actual assessment of history learning objectives and they really struggle. So that's pretty much the same kind of teacher that Mr. Keating is. Very strong comparison there. So Todd and Neil, while they're getting some great life lessons, are going to really lack analysis and writing skills if Mr. Keating doesn't use his time more effectively. Mr. Keating could also increase differentiation in his class. We know that differentiation is basically tailoring your instruction to address all different kinds of student needs. And while he does do this in some ways through the strong relationships that he develops with students, so he gets to know them really well, like Todd, where he can see when he's struggling and he talks to him one-on-one to give him that support that he needs. But there's really no official structures in place to support students, so that's something he can improve on. You can see in the top photo here, there's a group of students in his class, which includes Todd and Neil, and they feel like they want to improve their knowledge of reading and interpreting poetry, so they actually form their own study group, which is, a great initiative. But students like Neil and Todd have that advantage of a strong peer support group, as I mentioned earlier, to turn to for that sort of thing. So Mr. Keating needs to address the students who might be academically struggling and don't have that advantage of a strong peer group. So I recommend that he develops maybe a peer tutoring program for his class, or even after class, a teacher tutoring program to address the different needs of his students. Now we come to Mr. Keating's weaknesses, the things that I recommend based on what we know from educational psychology that he should completely eliminate or change. So first of all, his curriculum is very Eurocentric. So you can see in the top photo, he's reading from a book, which is actually a book of Walt Whitman's poetry. Walt Whitman, Henry Thoreau, Shakespeare, these are all primary poets that he selects for reading material, which, as you know, these are poets with a lot of merit, but what do they all have in common other than that? They're all white men of European culture, so they're not very diverse. We know from our discussions of student diversity that actually multicultural education can be really beneficial in improving student educational outcomes. Even though his English class at Welton is not very diverse at all, as a boys' school, they're all boys. As a prep school, most are middle class or very wealthy and mostly white. But that doesn't mean that these students can't benefit from learning about different cultures and seeing things from different perspectives and really just confronting their privileges. So I recommend that Mr. Keating eliminates a lot of the Eurocentric material he teaches and replaces it with more multicultural material. The other issue with his class is that he needs to completely restructure and change the teacher-centered model that he uses. As I mentioned earlier, he's a very engaging and motivating and charismatic lecturer, which is great, for grabbing students' attention at the start of a class. But an effective teacher doesn't spend the whole class just talking at the students without asking for their input, which is mostly what Mr. Keating does. We know that a more student-centered approach that involves a lot of cooperative learning can really benefit students by giving them vital problem solving and critical thinking skills, as well as other positive outcomes like improved self-esteem or self-confidence or better peer relationships and social skills, which is something that can really benefit students, specifically like Todd, who lacks those type of skills. I also mentioned earlier that Mr. Keating focuses on teaching a lot of, life lessons, like warning against the dangers of conformity with that marching activity. Well, what better way to teach students to be independent thinkers than applying that strategy to your class structure? So I really recommend that Mr. Keating changes his class from a teacher-centered to a student-centered model. And you'll see in the lesson plan on the next slide some strategies that he can use to actually do that. This lesson plan is centered on the poets of the Harlem Renaissance, so straight off the bat, it's more inclusive and multicultural by highlighting the perspectives of women and people of color through the poems Harlem by Langston Hughes and My Little Dreams by George Douglas Johnson. The objectives of this lesson are to compare the themes, tones, and formats of these poems, and then to create individual poems inspired by them. So the lesson will begin with an introduction of the themes of dreams in these poems and their jazz-like rhythmic structures indicative of the Harlem Renaissance. So Mr. Keating's really engaging and motivational language and lecture style can really shine on this introduction of the lesson, but the whole lesson is not a teacher-centered lecture. Students will then do a short starter activity, which is inspired by the kinds of unconventional activities that already seem to work really well in Mr. Keating's class to engage students and involve movement. So they'll allow students to gather seats and reenact the stages that dreams are described to go through in each poem in time to jazz music because of the rhythmic structure of the poems. And that will be with Mr. Keating's guidance. But it'll only be for 10 minutes, so you won't be overdoing time on that unconventional kind of activity, on that task. The main part of the lesson will actually incorporate student-centered and cooperative learning strategies by having students do a think, pair, share, analyzing and comparing the themes and meanings of the poems with a partner and then sharing their interpretations. We also know from the 7 steps of an effective lesson that a good lesson needs independent practice. So students will then write their own poems inspired by the themes and or rhythm of the discussed Harlem Renaissance poems, as Mr. Keating circulates and provides extra support and differentiation to students who might be struggling. An effective lesson also needs assessment. So at the end, there'll be an exit ticket when students will write 2 words on the chalkboard, summing up what they took away from each poem. And then as an assignment for homework and way of using distributed practice, students will finish up their individual poems. So to sum it all up, here are some key takeaways that I've gained from this case study and just from studying educational psychology. From this case study, I've learned that motivation isn't everything needed for an effective teacher. You know, a lot of people might look at Mr. Keating and see just an amazing teacher who needs no improvements because his students are all just so engaged and so interested in attending his class and reading about poetry. But he's really not using the best instructional strategies to give them the writing and critical thinking skills they should be getting from a high school English class to meet those high school English learning objectives. On the other hand of that, though, I've also learned that socio-emotional learning is just as necessary as content and academic learning in a classroom. Because of students like especially Neil and Todd who lack that socio-emotional support until they find it in the relationship that they developed with Mr. Keating, I've learned that it's really difficult and challenging for students who lack that socio-emotional support and skills to really succeed in school academically without it. In terms of educational psychology, I think one thing I've learned that's really going to benefit me as a student is all the cognitive learning strategies of educational psychology in terms of how the brain processes memory and the strategies I can use to be a better self-regulated learner and use better study strategies. I think these are really useful pieces of information to have as a student of any subject. And then as a future teacher, I think studying educational psychology really shows me how intentionality is important in everything I do and gives me the basis to be an intentional teacher and create effective lessons because I now know the research and science behind why some effective strategies are more effective than others. Like, for example, I know how to group students and why ineffective methods of grouping are actually proven to be ineffective, why they're proven to be ineffective by educational psychology research. And now hopefully you can provide me with some suggestions. So one thing I'm hoping we can provide feedback on is maybe some suggestions of other potential differentiation strategies I can use in my lesson plan. So I just recommended that Mr. Heating circulates and supports struggling students during the Think, Pair, Share, but what other ideas do you have that I could incorporate? I'm also wondering generally outside of just that lesson plan, what other strategies I might recommend to Mr. Keating to support struggling students other than the peer tutoring and teacher-student tutoring strategies I suggested. Then in terms of giving Mr. Keating an overall evaluation grade, I wanted to know how you would suggest I weigh the results versus strategies. So what I mean by that is all the students are very engaged, but he's not using the most effective strategies in the classroom recommended by educational psychology. So what criteria can you use to balance out that and give him a proper evaluation? And then I just have my references here. So thank you all so much for listening. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing your suggestions.